What if the history of Israel and Iran wasn't just about politics, but a spiritual battle foretold thousands of years ago? What if the tensions we see today were written into the pages of the Bible long before? Let's explore how these two nations are connected through prophecy and divine promise. Welcome to a journey into the ancient origins of Israel and Iran. From the biblical story of Abraham and his two sons to the rise of Islam and the modern conflicts we see today, we will uncover the deeper spiritual story behind the relationship between these two nations. In this video, we'll trace the roots of the conflict between Israel and Iran, looking at the biblical account of Abraham's sons, the rise of Islam, and how these nations play crucial roles in the end-time prophecies. Stay with us as we unravel this powerful story of divine promise, conflict, and prophecy. 1. The biblical origin. Abraham and the promise. The conflict between Israel and Iran is not just political. It has deep roots in the Bible, stretching back to the time of Abraham. In Genesis 12, God made an extraordinary promise to Abraham. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you." Genesis 12:2. This promise was foundational for Israel, establishing that Abraham's descendants would inherit a special land, one flowing with milk and honey, a land that would become known as the Promised Land. But this promise didn't come without challenges. Abraham and his wife Sarah were unable to have children. As years passed and the promise seemed delayed, Sarah grew anxious. She decided to take matters into her own hands and offered her maidservant Hagar to Abraham, believing that this would be the way to fulfill God's promise. Hagar bore Abraham's first son, Ishmael. God, however, made it clear that Ishmael, though blessed, was not the child of the promise. God promised Abraham that Sarah, despite her old age, would bear him a son, Isaac, the child through whom the covenant would continue. Isaac's birth marks the beginning of a spiritual and territorial divide that has continued for thousands of years. God reaffirmed that it was through Isaac that his covenant would be established, while Ishmael, though blessed, would become the father of a different line. The rivalry between Isaac and Ishmael, though rooted in family, became much more than a personal conflict. It set the stage for the struggle over the spiritual inheritance of God's promises. God had a prophecy for Ishmael, declaring, "He will be like a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him." Genesis 16:12. This prophecy laid the foundation for the rivalry that would persist for generations, not just between two brothers, but between entire nations. The descendants of Isaac would become the people of Israel, and the descendants of Ishmael would give rise to the Arab nations. The ongoing conflict we see today, particularly between Israel and Iran, is rooted in this ancient division. The descendants of Isaac formed the kingdom of Israel and later the nation of Israel, while the descendants of Ishmael gave rise to various Arab peoples. Over the centuries, these two groups developed distinct cultures, religions, and identities, often in opposition to one another. The Israelites, the chosen people of God, laid claim to the land promised to Abraham, while the descendants of Ishmael, feeling excluded from this covenant, developed their own powerful empires. The tension between these two groups became not just about land, but also about spiritual inheritance. The emergence of Islam in the 7th century AD added a new layer to this ancient conflict. Muhammad, a descendant of Ishmael, claimed that Ishmael, not Isaac, was the true heir to the Abrahamic promises. This theological shift was monumental, and it created a deep rift between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. While Jews and Christians believed that Isaac's line carried the divine promise, Muslims believed that the true heirs were those from Ishmael's line. The rise of Islam thus reignited the ancient conflict over spiritual inheritance and territory. As the centuries passed, the descendants of Isaac, now known as the Jewish people, remained scattered across the globe after the destruction of their kingdom. Yet they held firm to the belief that God's promises were still in effect, and they prayed for a return to their promised land. Meanwhile, the descendants of Ishmael expanded the influence of Islam, forming vast empires and spreading their faith across much of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Then, in 1948, Israel was reborn as a nation after nearly 2,000 years in exile. This miraculous return to the land was seen as the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham and his descendants. But the creation of Israel ignited immediate conflict. Arab nations, many of them descendants of Ishmael, rejected Israel's right to exist. To them, Israel's establishment was not just a political issue. It was an affront to their own spiritual claims to the land. The battle for Israel's existence was a struggle for who had the right to inherit the promises made to Abraham. Israel's creation marked the rebirth of the ancient rivalry, and it was not only about territory, it was a theological and spiritual battle. The nations surrounding Israel, including Iran, viewed the establishment of the Jewish state as a challenge to their own claim to the Abrahamic promises. This conflict deepened as Israel struggled to defend its right to exist, while neighboring Arab nations, many of them descendants of Ishmael, viewed Israel's very presence as a violation of their spiritual inheritance. For Iran, the conflict with Israel took on a particularly spiritual and prophetic dimension. Though Iran had once been an ally of Israel, especially during the reign of the Shah, the Islamic Revolution of 1979 radically changed that relationship. Under Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran became an Islamic republic and declared itself a defender of the Palestinian cause, severing its ties with Israel and positioning itself as one of Israel's fiercest adversaries. Iran, with its Shiite interpretation of Islam, viewed Israel not just as a political enemy, but as a theological one. This shift was fueled by a belief that Israel's existence posed a threat to the fulfillment of their religious destiny. Today, the ongoing conflict between Israel and Iran, steeped in both political and spiritual challenges, can be traced directly to the ancient rivalry between Isaac and Ishmael. The two nations, Israel and Iran, have found themselves at odds over both land and spiritual inheritance, carrying forward a conflict that began thousands of years ago with a promise made to a man named Abraham. The origins of this conflict are far more than political. They are deeply spiritual, rooted in the biblical promises given to Abraham. These ancient prophecies continue to unfold in the world today, shaping the modern-day tensions between Israel and Iran. What began with a family dispute continues to be a defining factor in global politics, and the Bible's narrative provides an essential framework for understanding these events. As believers, it's essential to reflect on how God's promises to Abraham continue to influence the world today, and how the ancient struggle between Isaac and Ishmael still echoes in the geopolitical landscape. 2. The rise of Israel and the Arab world. Conflict begins. The story of Israel and the Arab world begins with a spiritual and cultural divide that dates back thousands of years. After Isaac's birth, his descendants formed the nation of Israel, known as the people of God, while the descendants of Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn, branched out into various Arab tribes. Over time, these two groups, both claiming the legacy of Abraham, developed distinct identities. Israel became the chosen people of God, while the Arab nations, descended from Ishmael, felt that they too held a share in the promises made to Abraham. Isaac's descendants, through his son Jacob, later known as Israel, formed the 12 tribes that would become the Jewish people. These tribes were initially united under the leadership of figures like Moses and Joshua, who led them into the promised land, Canaan. The Israelites' claim to this land was central to their faith and their identity, as it was the land God promised them in the covenant. They believed that this land was divinely ordained, and they were tasked with being a holy nation, a light to the world. The descendants of Ishmael, on the other hand, spread across the desert regions of the Middle East. The Arab tribes settled in the areas that are now modern-day Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and parts of Iraq and Syria. These tribes grew in number and influence, often living in a state of semi-nomadic existence. As time passed, they formed various powerful empires and kingdoms, though none were able to rival the military and political might of Israel in the ancient world. Still, their sense of identity was deeply tied to their heritage as the children of Abraham, and they longed to claim their own part in the divine promises made to him. The tension between the Israelites and the descendants of Ishmael deepened over time. Although the two groups shared a common ancestor, their relationship was one of rivalry rather than cooperation. In the Bible, this is seen as early as the birth of Isaac, when Sarah, Isaac's mother, expelled Hagar, Ishmael's mother, and her son Ishmael from their home. This was not just a domestic dispute. It was the beginning of a broader cultural and spiritual divide. While Isaac was the child of promise, Ishmael was not. Yet he was still blessed by God and promised that his descendants would become a great nation. Genesis 17:20. The tension escalated as Israel established itself in the Promised Land. The Israelites' history is marked by struggles for survival, as they were often at odds with the neighboring nations, including those descended from Ishmael. Though there were times of peaceful coexistence, Israel's history is largely defined by military conflict with various kingdoms and empires. The Arab tribes, many of whom were descended from Ishmael, often found themselves at odds with the Israelites, particularly when it came to territorial claims in the land of Canaan. This territorial conflict became even more complex when the rise of Islam in the 7th century introduced a new ideological and theological shift. The Prophet Muhammad, who emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, claimed to be the final prophet in the Abrahamic tradition. His teachings were based on a new interpretation of the scriptures that redefined the inheritance of the promise made to Abraham. According to Islamic tradition, it was Ishmael, not Isaac, who was the true heir to God's covenant. This theological claim set the stage for centuries of conflict, as it directly contradicted the beliefs of both Jews and Christians, who held that Isaac was the rightful heir. The spread of Islam across the Middle East transformed the political and spiritual landscape. As Islamic empires rose in the 7th and 8th centuries, they expanded rapidly, bringing vast territories under Muslim rule, including the lands once held by Israel. The new Muslim caliphates saw themselves as the true inheritors of Abraham's promise, and they often clashed with the Jews, whom they viewed as an obstacle to the fulfillment of God's plan as they understood it. The struggle for control of Jerusalem, a city sacred to all three Abrahamic faiths, became a focal point for these tensions. The Islamic conquests spread rapidly, and the Arab empires that emerged in the wake of these conquests sought to establish control over the territories that the Israelites once inhabited. Despite periods of coexistence under Muslim rule, the tension between the two groups remained, especially as both sides viewed the land as sacred. This rivalry, rooted in the theological differences between Judaism and Islam, would continue to shape the course of history, culminating in the modern-day conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors, including Iran. In the 20th century, as Zionism grew and Jews began returning to the land of Israel, the ancient rivalry found new expression. The 1948 establishment of the State of Israel was a turning point in the conflict. For the descendants of Isaac, this was the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. But for the descendants of Ishmael, particularly those in surrounding Arab nations, it was seen as an affront to their own claim to the land, which they viewed as rightfully theirs due to their ancestral and religious ties to Abraham. The rejection of Israel's existence by many Arab nations, including Iran, marked the beginning of a new chapter in this age-old struggle. The rise of Iran as a regional power and its eventual turn against Israel after the 1979 Islamic Revolution further deepened the conflict. Iran, once a strategic ally of Israel, became one of its most vocal enemies. This ideological shift was not just political, it was deeply rooted in religious and spiritual beliefs. The Islamic Republic of Iran, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, rejected Israel's right to exist, framing the conflict as a battle not just over land, but over the legitimacy of God's covenant and the inheritance of Abraham's promises. The rivalry between Israel and Iran is thus a continuation of the ancient conflict between the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael. It is a struggle that spans both spiritual and territorial dimensions. The conflict is not just about politics, it is a battle for spiritual inheritance, with each side claiming the legacy of Abraham. As we continue to examine this ancient rivalry, we can see that the roots of this conflict run deep, and its resolution may depend on a much broader divine plan that is still unfolding. 3. The birth of Islam, a new claim to the promise. The emergence of Islam in the 7th century AD marked a dramatic shift in the religious and spiritual landscape of the Middle East. At the heart of this transformation was the figure of Muhammad, a prophet from the Arabian Peninsula who redefined the legacy of Abraham and his descendants. While Jews and Christians both claimed Isaac as the true heir of Abraham's promise, Muhammad and his followers argued that Ishmael was the legitimate heir, making the Islamic faith the new holder of God's covenant. This theological shift intensified the existing rivalry between the descendants of Isaac, the Jewish people, and the descendants of Ishmael, the Arab nations, and by extension, laid the groundwork for future conflicts, including the tension between Israel and Iran. Muhammad, born around 570 CE in Mecca, was a member of the Quraysh tribe. At the age of 40, he began receiving revelations, which he claimed were delivered by the angel Gabriel. These revelations became the foundation of the Quran, the holy book of Islam. Islam teaches that there is only one God, Allah, and that Muhammad is the last in a line of prophets, including figures such as Moses and Jesus, who are also revered in Islam. However, Islam asserts that the true legacy of Abraham lies with Ishmael, not Isaac. This claim directly contradicted the Jewish and Christian teachings that Isaac, the son of Sarah, was the heir to God's promise. The theological assertion that Ishmael, rather than Isaac, was the true son of promise had profound implications for the Abrahamic faiths. In Islam's view, the Jews and Christians had misunderstood or misinterpreted the true meaning of God's covenant with Abraham. The Islamic claim to the promise of Abraham was therefore not just a spiritual stance, but also a political and territorial one, as it gave the Muslim world a claim to the lands of Israel and surrounding regions. Muhammad's teachings also emphasized the importance of submission to the will of Allah, which is encapsulated in the term Islam, meaning submission. The faith rapidly spread across the Arabian Peninsula, and within a century of Muhammad's death in 632 AD, Islamic empires had expanded into large parts of North Africa, Spain, and the Middle East, including regions that were once part of Israel and Judea. The spread of Islam fundamentally reshaped the political and spiritual landscape of the region, further deepening the conflict between the followers of Abraham's two sons. For the followers of Islam, this new faith was not only a continuation of the Abrahamic tradition, but also a correction of what they believed to be the distortions and errors introduced by Judaism and Christianity. Muslims believed that God's message had been partially revealed through the earlier prophets, but that it was now fully realized in the Quran, with Muhammad serving as the final prophet. This belief further entrenched the ideological divide between the three Abrahamic faiths, as each religion laid claim to the true inheritance of Abraham's covenant. As Islam spread, the Islamic empires grew in power and influence, with the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates becoming major political and military forces. For Muslims, the establishment of Islamic rule over former Christian and Jewish lands was not just about territory, it was a continuation of God's will. These empires built vast and impressive civilizations, which included advancements in science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. However, their expansion into the former lands of Israel and the Holy Land brought them into direct conflict with Jewish and Christian communities who considered these lands sacred. The Islamic conquest of Jerusalem in 638 AD marked a significant turning point. For Muslims, the city was now part of their religious heritage, as it was the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina. For Jews, it was the site of the ancient temple, and for Christians, it was the location of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. The struggle for control of Jerusalem thus became a symbol of the broader theological and territorial conflict between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, a struggle that would continue for centuries. This religious and territorial conflict did not remain confined to the ancient world. As time passed, Islam's theological claim to the inheritance of Abraham's promises influenced the politics of the Middle East. The division between Jews and Muslims over the legitimacy of their claims to the land of Israel intensified, especially as the Western powers during the Crusades and later in the colonial period became involved in the region. The idea that Islam, as the true heir of Abraham's promises, had a divine right to the land continued to shape the narrative, especially in the Arab world. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the rise of Iran as a powerful Islamic state marked a new chapter in this long-standing conflict. The Islamic Revolution of 1979, which overthrew the Shah and brought Ayatollah Khomeini to power, introduced a new ideological perspective that emphasized Iran's role as the defender of Islam and the protector of Muslims worldwide. Under Khomeini's leadership, Iran rejected the legitimacy of Israel, framing the Jewish state as an obstacle to the fulfillment of Islamic prophecy. Iran's revolutionary ideology, rooted in the belief that the West had corrupted the world and that the Islamic world must be liberated from foreign influence, made Israel a primary target of Iranian hostility. The Islamic Republic of Iran, in its opposition to Israel, framed the conflict as not just a political struggle but a religious one, in line with the prophetic claims that had been made since the rise of Islam. This theological conflict between the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael was now playing out in the modern world, and it would continue to define much of the geopolitics of the Middle East. Iran's view of Israel as illegitimate and its insistence on supporting groups that seek to destroy Israel, such as Hezbollah and Hamas, are deeply rooted in the ideological teachings of Islam, which began with Muhammad's claim to the Abrahamic legacy. This religious and spiritual struggle, rooted in the competing claims to Abraham's promises, has shaped not only the history of the Middle East but also the modern world's political and religious landscape. As we move forward, it's clear that the legacy of this ancient theological divide continues to have far-reaching consequences, not only for Israel and Iran, but for the entire global community. The battle between these two nations is not merely about borders and land. It is about the legitimacy of their spiritual inheritance and their claim to God's promises. 4. The return of Israel, rebirth and rejection. The miraculous rebirth of Israel as a nation in 1948 marked a pivotal moment in history, as God's promise to Abraham and his descendants seemed to be fulfilled in a way that no one could have predicted. For nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people had been scattered across the globe, exiled from their homeland, living as minorities in various countries. The dream of returning to the land of Israel seemed to fade, but the heart of God's covenant with his people remained alive in the hearts of his faithful followers. The establishment of Israel in 1948, after centuries of exile and persecution, was nothing short of a miracle, a clear sign of God's providence at work. The creation of Israel, however, was not without controversy. The surrounding Arab nations, many of which were descendants of Ishmael, saw the creation of the Jewish state as a grave injustice. For them, the establishment of Israel was not merely a territorial dispute, it was a theological and spiritual affront. The land of Israel was sacred not only to Jews but to Muslims as well, who had long claimed it as part of their religious heritage. To the Arab world, the presence of a Jewish state in the heart of the Middle East was seen as a challenge to their identity and a direct contradiction to the spiritual claims that Islam held to the promise of Abraham's descendants. In response to the proclamation of the State of Israel, 5 neighboring Arab countries, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon, immediately launched a military invasion. This first Arab-Israeli war in 1948 was not only a struggle for territory, it was a battle for spiritual and national identity. The Arab nations, driven by a belief that the land belonged to the descendants of Ishmael, sought to eliminate the newly established Jewish state. Their actions were fueled by the belief that the rightful heirs of the Abrahamic promise could not possibly be the Jewish people, whom they viewed as usurpers. Despite the overwhelming odds, Israel prevailed. Against all expectations, the newly formed Israeli military successfully defended its sovereignty, and the Jewish state expanded its borders beyond what had been allotted by the United Nations. The victory of Israel in this war was seen by Jews worldwide as the fulfillment of God's promises to his people. It was a sign that God had not forgotten his covenant, and that he was once again working through the Jewish people to restore them to their land. However, this victory came at a great cost. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes in the newly formed State of Israel, creating a refugee crisis that would persist for generations. The Palestinian people, who also considered the land to be their heritage, saw the establishment of Israel as a betrayal of their own rights. This created an enduring sense of resentment and injustice, which would fuel the ongoing conflict in the region. The Arab world, particularly the nations that descended from the line of Ishmael, refused to accept the legitimacy of Israel. The conflict over Israel's existence was not just about land, but about identity, religious inheritance, and spiritual legitimacy. The surrounding nations rejected Israel's right to exist as a sovereign state, and they continued to deny the Jewish people their claim to the land promised to them by God. The theological implications of Israel's creation were immense. For the Jews, the rebirth of Israel was not merely a political event. It was the sign of God's faithfulness to his covenant. The Jewish people believed that the establishment of Israel was the first step in God's plan to fulfill the prophecies of the Hebrew Scriptures. The return to the Promised Land was seen as the beginning of the redemption of the Jewish people and the fulfillment of God's promise to restore them to their homeland after centuries of exile. For the Arab world, however, Israel's existence was a direct challenge to their own theological claims. The belief that the descendants of Ishmael were the true heirs of Abraham's promise created a deep sense of rivalry. To the Muslim world, the land of Israel was sacred, and the presence of a Jewish state in the heart of the Middle East was viewed as a usurpation of that sacred land. The rejection of Israel was not merely a political stance. It was a theological stance rooted in the belief that the covenant of Abraham had passed through Ishmael, not Isaac. This rejection of Israel's existence set the stage for the decades of conflict that would follow. Israel, though victorious, faced constant threats from its neighbors. The Arab-Israeli conflict became a defining feature of the Middle East, as the Jewish state fought to maintain its sovereignty and its right to exist, while the Arab world continued to deny its legitimacy. The conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors was not just about borders and territory. It was about the right to claim the promises of God and the legitimacy of the spiritual inheritance of Abraham. As the years passed, the animosity between Israel and the surrounding Arab nations only deepened. The failure to reach a lasting peace agreement fueled bitterness and resentment on both sides. The struggle for Israel's survival became a central theme in the history of the Middle East, and the world watched as the two sides continued to fight for control of a land that held deep religious and historical significance. In this battle for identity, territory, and spiritual inheritance, the legacy of Abraham's two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, remained at the heart of the conflict. The rivalry that began with the birth of Isaac and Ishmael continued to shape the destiny of the region, and as the tensions in the Middle East continued to rise, it became clear that this struggle was not just a political or territorial one. It was a spiritual battle for the promises of God, a battle that would shape the future of the nations involved for generations to come. As we reflect on the creation of Israel in 1948, we are reminded that the promises of God are unshakable, and that his plan for the nations is unfolding according to his perfect will. The return of Israel to the land is a powerful reminder that God is faithful to his word and that he is sovereign over the affairs of nations. While the conflict continues, the story of Israel's rebirth serves as a testament to God's power and faithfulness to his people. 5. Iran's revolutionary shift, from ally to adversary. The geopolitical landscape of the Middle East was drastically altered in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. Up until that moment, Iran, under the leadership of Shah Reza Pahlavi, was considered a key ally of Israel in the region. The Shah, who came to power in the 1950s, had pursued policies of modernization and westernization, often relying on American support to maintain his rule. During this time, Israel and Iran shared not only diplomatic ties but also military and intelligence cooperation, a partnership that was built on mutual concerns about regional stability. However, the Shah's rule came to an abrupt end when the Islamic Revolution, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, overthrew the monarchy and established an Islamic republic. This marked a dramatic shift in Iran's political and religious landscape. Khomeini and his followers sought to replace the secular government with a theocratic system grounded in Shia Islam, and in doing so, they rejected the Western influence that had permeated Iran under the Shah's reign. The revolution's effects were immediate and far-reaching. One of the most significant shifts was in Iran's foreign policy. With the fall of the Shah, Iran severed its ties with Israel. The new government, under Khomeini, viewed Israel as a symbol of Western imperialism and oppression and declared it an illegitimate state. Khomeini's anti-Israel rhetoric became a cornerstone of the new regime's ideological foundation, with Iran positioning itself as the leader of the Muslim world's resistance against Israel and the West. This dramatic turn from ally to adversary deepened the rift between Israel and Iran. Iran's new leadership saw Israel not just as a political rival, but as a theological enemy. The regime adopted a radical stance, declaring that Israel was the little Satan, while the United States, a strong ally of Israel, was labeled the Great Satan. These statements encapsulated the new worldview that was emerging in Iran, a worldview in which the Islamic Revolution was positioned as a global movement to rid the Muslim world of Western influence, with Israel at the heart of that opposition. In the decades that followed the revolution, Iran's hostility towards Israel only intensified. Iran began to actively support groups and organizations that were dedicated to challenging Israel's existence, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. These groups received significant financial, military, and logistical support from Iran, and in return, they served as proxies in Iran's ongoing conflict with Israel. Hezbollah, in particular, became a major threat to Israeli security, carrying out attacks on Israeli targets and maintaining a strong presence along Israel's northern border. While Iran's direct military engagement with Israel was limited, the support for these proxy groups kept the pressure on Israel, creating a continuous cycle of violence and retaliation. The conflict between Israel and these Iranian-backed groups was not just about territory or military power. It was about the ideological and theological battle for the future of the region. Iran viewed the destruction of Israel as a religious duty, something that was part of the fulfillment of Islamic prophecy. As the decades passed, Iran's role in the Middle East became even more entrenched. Under the leadership of Khomeini's successors, including his spiritual heir, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran continued to cultivate its influence across the region. Its support for groups opposed to Israel's existence expanded, and Iran's commitment to eliminating the Zionist regime became more pronounced. The regime's rhetoric was not just confined to political statements, but permeated the fabric of Iranian society. Anti-Israel and anti-Semitic sentiments were taught in schools, broadcasted on state-run television, and instilled in the population through religious sermons and public speeches by leaders. The rise of Iran as a dominant power in the Middle East was not solely confined to its support for Israel's enemies. Iran's nuclear program became a focal point of international concern, as many feared that Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons could lead to the creation of a powerful deterrent against Israel. For Israel, Iran's nuclear ambitions were viewed as an existential threat. Iran's leaders had openly stated their desire to see Israel wiped off the map, and the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran was seen as a terrifying reality. In response, Israel adopted a policy of preemptive strikes. Israel's military strategy was designed to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, and there were numerous covert operations and airstrikes aimed at destroying key Iranian nuclear facilities. The most notable of these was Israel's involvement in the Stuxnet cyber attack, which successfully sabotaged Iran's nuclear program by damaging its uranium enrichment infrastructure. While the international community, including the United States, attempted to engage Iran diplomatically, these efforts were often met with resistance. The diplomatic efforts culminated in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, also known as the Iran Nuclear Deal, signed in 2015. The deal, which was intended to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions in exchange for the lifting of sanctions, was met with skepticism and outright opposition from Israel. Israel's leaders, particularly Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, argued that the deal did not go far enough in preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons and that it posed a serious threat to Israeli security. In 2018, President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew the United States from the JCPOA, citing Iran's continued regional aggression and failure to comply with the terms of the agreement. This withdrawal further strained relations between Iran and Israel, and the situation in the Middle East grew more volatile. The continuing tension over Iran's nuclear program, its support for militant groups, and its ideological commitment to Israel's destruction created a dangerous and unstable environment. As the years have passed, the conflict between Israel and Iran has evolved into a multifaceted struggle that involves not only military and political power, but also religious ideology and prophecy. For Israel, Iran's stance represents a theological battle for survival, one that reaches back to the promises made to Abraham and his descendants. For Iran, its opposition to Israel is not just about politics. It is deeply rooted in religious convictions and the desire to establish Islamic supremacy in the region. This ideological clash has led to a never-ending cycle of conflict, one that shows no signs of resolving anytime soon. In the final analysis, the rise of Iran as an adversary to Israel is a story of profound spiritual and geopolitical transformation. The long-standing alliance between the two nations has given way to a deep and enduring enmity, one that is shaping the future of the Middle East and the world. Iran's revolutionary shift from ally to adversary has altered the balance of power in the region, setting the stage for a showdown that will have far-reaching consequences for both nations and the broader world order. 6. Iran and Israel in Prophecy, a vision of the end times. Throughout history, the tension between Israel and Iran has been shaped by both political and theological factors. But for believers, it is also deeply rooted in prophecy. The Bible, particularly the books of Ezekiel and Revelation, contains startling visions that seem to point directly to the role these two nations will play in the final days. As we examine the current state of affairs in the Middle East, we see how these ancient prophecies might be unfolding before our eyes. In Ezekiel 38 and 39, the prophet speaks of a future invasion of Israel by a coalition of nations led by Gog, a ruler from the land of Magog. While the identity of Gog is debated, many scholars believe it represents a powerful leader from the north, which could refer to Russia or a coalition of nations. What is particularly striking, however, is the mention of Persia in these passages. In Ezekiel 38:5, Persia, modern-day Iran, is listed as one of the nations in the alliance that will rise up against Israel in the last days. This prophecy, written over 2,500 years ago, speaks to the pivotal role Iran will play in the final global conflict. This alliance, which will include other nations such as Kush, likely referring to regions in Africa, Put, modern-day Libya, and Togarmah, likely Turkey, will come against Israel in a time of perceived peace and security. The Bible suggests that Israel will be dwelling in a false sense of safety, unprepared for the coming invasion. This sets the stage for a time of great tribulation, where the nations of the world will converge on Israel, challenging its very existence. However, this invasion is not without a divine intervention. Ezekiel 38:18-23 describes how God himself will intervene, bringing judgment upon the attacking nations. Earthquakes, floods, fire, and brimstone will rain down upon them, and confusion will strike their armies. The text emphasizes that Israel will not fight this battle alone. God will protect his people, and the enemies of Israel will be defeated. This prophecy assures believers that, despite the seeming might of the nations coming against Israel, God's sovereignty will prevail in the end. The inclusion of Persia, Iran, in this coalition against Israel is not just a political statement. It has significant spiritual implications. Iran's current stance against Israel, its support for militant groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, and its ongoing pursuit of nuclear capabilities all seem to align with the prophetic picture painted by Ezekiel. Iran's leadership has openly called for the destruction of Israel, a position that aligns with the prophetic vision of an Iranian-led alliance seeking to annihilate the Jewish state. But what does this mean for the faithful? The Bible's prophecy of Gog and Magog is a reminder that even in times of deep political tension and warfare, God remains in control. The unfolding of these prophecies is not a sign of hopelessness, but of hope for those who trust in God's promises. Israel's protection is assured not because of its own strength, but because God has chosen it as His people. As believers, we are reminded to keep our eyes on the unfolding events, to remain vigilant, and to trust that God's plan is being fulfilled, even when it seems uncertain or difficult to understand. The inclusion of Persia in this prophecy is also a call to prayer and intercession for the nations involved. While the Bible foretells a dark period for Israel, it also gives hope that God's light will shine through in the darkest times. For Christians today, this prophecy serves as a powerful reminder that God's purposes will ultimately triumph. The nations may rise against Israel, but they will not prevail. God's intervention will be swift, and His glory will be revealed for all the world to see. This prophetic vision also echoes the words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, where He speaks of the end times, the rise of false prophets, and the tribulations that will come. In Matthew 24:6-7, Jesus warns His followers about wars, rumors of wars, and nations rising against nations. While these signs might cause fear, He assures His followers that these events are part of God's plan. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Matthew 24:13. This reinforces the idea that while we may face trials and challenges, God's faithfulness will carry us through. In Revelation 16, we are given a glimpse into the final battle at Armageddon, where the nations of the world, including those from the east, will come against Jerusalem. This climactic event, like the invasion foretold in Ezekiel, involves a coalition of forces aligning against Israel. However, just as in Ezekiel, God's intervention will lead to a stunning victory for Israel. The book of Revelation points to a future where Christ returns in glory to defeat the forces of evil once and for all, establishing His reign on earth. For believers, this is the ultimate victory, the moment when all things are made right and God's kingdom is fully established. As we look at the current tensions between Israel and Iran, we see the stage being set for the fulfillment of these ancient prophecies. The rise of militant Islamic regimes, the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, and the nuclear threat posed by Iran all fit within the prophetic narrative outlined in Scripture. While these events may be troubling, they also serve as a reminder of God's sovereignty and the assurance that His plan will unfold according to His will. In the face of such uncertain times, Christians are called to remain steadfast in their faith, to trust in God's protection, and to watch eagerly for His return. The prophecy of Iran's role in the end times serves as a powerful reminder that, no matter how chaotic the world becomes, God is working out His purposes for the good of His people. Let us take comfort in this, knowing that the ultimate victory belongs to God, and His plans for Israel and the world will be fulfilled in His time. Conclusion. As we reflect on the ancient prophecies surrounding Israel and Iran, we are reminded of the powerful role that Scripture plays in revealing God's sovereign plan for the world. The biblical narrative, stretching from the days of Abraham to the unfolding events of today, highlights God's enduring promises not just for Israel but for all nations. The tensions we see today between Israel and Iran are not just political, they are deeply spiritual, rooted in millennia of prophecy and divine design. The Bible assures us that while nations may rise against Israel, they will not prevail. God's intervention, as described in Ezekiel and Revelation, promises that He will protect His people in the final battle. Despite the looming threats and uncertainties, the faithful can take comfort knowing that God's sovereignty is at work behind the scenes. His word will never fail, and His ultimate victory is assured. This prophetic reminder calls us to remain vigilant, trust in God's promises, and recognize the spiritual significance of current events. As we approach the end times, the role of Israel, Iran, and the other nations in prophecy should be a call to prayer, discernment, and faith. The world may seem uncertain, but for those who trust in God's plan, the future is filled with hope and the promise of His eternal reign. Let us stay watchful, knowing that the time is near when Christ will return and all things will be made new.